Hello everyone, my name is Kenton Kivestu. I'm an ex-BCG consultant, an ex-Googler, and the founder of RocketBlocks, an online platform that helps students prepare for case interviews. In today's RocketBlocks mini lesson, we're going to be talking about an incredibly important aspect of the case interview, which is your own conclusion to the case problem. Now, I am not here to tell you that first impressions don't matter. First impressions are incredibly important. But what I want to talk about today is another aspect that often doesn't get the attention it really deserves, which is the conclusion. Now, there's a Nobel Prize winning economist named Daniel Kahneman that has done a ton of research on this. He's done a ton of research on how people perceive events and experiences and essentially how their memories of those events are formed. And he has a theory that's called peak-end theory. Now, what exactly is this theory? Basically, the theory states that people's memories of any given event or experience will be defined by two things. One, the peak, so that's either the best part of the experience or the worst part of the experience, and then the end of the experience. So this is really important and interesting, and it has an obvious insight for case interviewers, which is that the conclusion that you provide to an actual case can have an incredible weight on your interviewer's perception and memory of your performance. So for that reason, getting your conclusion right is incredibly important. And we've got a few great tips that are going to help you end on a strong note. So let's get started. Okay, so what makes for a strong conclusion? There are really 4 key tips that I want you to keep in mind. So first, let's talk about each of those 4 tips. And then after that, I'm going to do a live illustration of an okay conclusion, and then keeping in mind those 4 tips, a great conclusion to a case interview. So let's get started with the tips. Tip number 1 is structure, structure, structure. It is really hard to overemphasize how important structuring your conclusion is. Structured thinking and structured communication is at the crux of what management consultants are doing day in and day out. And so just as you begin the case interview itself by structuring a nebulous business problem, you're going to want to structure your conclusion as well. Think about a useful mental model to think about here is the concept of a Mad Lib. My recommendation is X. The supporting arguments are 1, 2, and 3, and some caveats and next steps that I think the client should consider are A, B, and C. Now, you don't necessarily want it to feel that robotic, but what I'm trying to communicate is a sense of a verbal scaffolding, the idea of here's my recommendation, here are the supporting arguments, and then here are some next steps that the client should consider. That will really help make your conclusion hit with impact and state it in a clear and logical way that makes it really easy for your interviewer to follow. Tip number 2, always use data-supported arguments. After making your key recommendation, you want to support it with a clear list of supporting arguments, and you want those to include the key pieces of analysis and data that you unearthed during the case. So say, for example, you're working on a case where a client is considering entering the European market for dental floss. And over the course of the case, you find that the potential market there is really large. So one potential supporting statement could be that the market opportunity is huge and really attractive for the client. Now, another way to say this might be the market opportunity is huge. We calculated that it's $400 million annually and growing at a 10% compounded annual growth rate and expected to continue for the next 10 years. Both statements that we just talked about are true, but the second one, because it's supported with some crisp data points, really hits with impact and shows that you're kind of tying all of the data and the analysis together in those key supporting points. So it's really going to make a much stronger impact. Tip number 3, always highlight next level insights. As you're going through and listing out your key arguments and the data points that support them, If there are next level kind of so what implications, that's definitely the stuff you want to highlight and make sure you call out. So going back to our mini example, if we're talking about entering the European market for dental floss, and we just calculated that the market size is 400 million annually, say we also learned throughout the course of the case that our client has an internal metric that they like to use. That essentially they like to make sure that within 3 years of entering a market, they're able to hit a $25 million annual revenue run rate. Now, you could do some math and figure out that that internal metric for revenue run rate means that they would need to achieve a 6% market share. And then, of course, highlighting that number is a nice next level insight because it sets up comparisons for the client about how they are able to compete in other markets and whether something like 6% sounds feasible to them. Tip number 4, always call out key caveats and next steps. Remember that you've only been on the case for maybe 30 to 45 minutes by the time you're giving your conclusion. And so for a complicated case, it's really going to have been hard for you to do full justice to a case in that time. And the good news is that your interviewer understands that and they're not going to expect it. But for that reason, it's really important to call out any key caveats that, if discovered, might change the recommendation you're proposing. And it's important to do this because it really demonstrates that you're thinking about the next level of your conclusion and recommendation. For example, in what cases might the outcome and the recommendation you're proposing change? And also, what next steps could your team and you take to do further analysis and either rule those out or determine a better course of action? Great. Now that we've covered these 4 tips for concluding your case interview well, we're going to take all of these lessons, put them together, and watch a few sample conclusions in action. To check those out, go to part 2 of this series on concluding well. There's a link down below in the description, so just click on that and check that out. And thank you for watching today, and we'll see you in part 2.